Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
I can't believe the monkeypox season is upon us already. I've only just taken down my Ukraine decorations. And it turns out that just about the only people in Washington, D.C. not involved in Russia collusion were Donald Trump and the Russians. And whilst I have no illusions at all on the Australian Labour Party and Albo, I'm sure glad that the reptilian Prime Minister Morrison down under has been turned upside down and he is out. We'll be talking to expert analysts about all of these matters, and we'll be talking about the war in Ukraine, and in particular its economic aspects, as the ruble, the much reviled, much sanctioned ruble, becomes the best performing currency in the world. Go figure. And it is 5 years exactly since I and my family were just 1 mile away when we heard the dull thud from the Manchester Arena, followed eventually by the wail of sirens and the news that an unspeakable horror, unforgettable, unspeakable horror had rolled out at the Ariana Grande concert, where an Islamist fanatic, one of the Libyan community in Manchester, who'd been carefully cultivated by the British intelligence services for decades, had returned to massacre our sons and daughters, particularly our daughters, in the Manchester Arena, a somber remembrance of the terrible day 5 years ago. So fasten your seatbelts. This is rock and roll radio television, though there's no radio anymore. But I've got some good news about the television. It's all coming up over the next 3 hours. And there are polls in which you can express your opinion. I, for the matter, am hearing myself in triplicate 3 times in my ear. So it's a miracle that I just managed to get all of that out without a script. Let's hope that at least improves.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
I'm only half joking. Well, the half that's a joke is that I ever had any Ukrainian decorations up in the first place. But if I had Ukrainian decorations up, I'd have to be taking them down, and I'd have to be raising the colours of the monkeypox. I can't believe it's not butter, as they say. We've just emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic, which swept the world, which killed millions of people, and which killed our economy through the measures that were adopted to counter it. All kinds of unforeseen, at least by the authorities, consequences to the COVID-19 response are now obvious. Our economy is virtually wrecked. Millions of people are ill, and many have died because they weren't able to access our health services because of the fear of, or the inability of, the NHS to respond to their needs. Millions of cancelled operations. You still can't see your doctor in person. In most places, at least, I've been living in Scotland for a year and a half and I have never seen my doctor. But me and the receptionist are on very good terms, at least. And they've come up with another one, the monkeypox. I mean, it looks like, I don't know, scabies. It looks like a common or garden skin, horrific but common skin eruption. And we're now being treated to exactly the same treatment that we were given in the run-up to the coronavirus pandemic. People are actually talking about vaccines, even though the vaccines that we've had are not discredited, certainly nothing like they cracked up to be. I am triple vaxxed. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. But I tell you, I'm not getting a monkeypox vaccine. And I'm not going to be locked down again. And moreover, the new World Health Organization treaty, which our countries are being invited, maybe even compelled to sign, will mean that no one country can take a different approach to the monkeypox and all subsequent poxes from any other. Our national sovereignty will have been pooled in the WHO, a heavily discredited organization led by a man with no credibility left at all. We'll be talking to James Melville, my new favourite Scotsman, a man who's risen without trace to being an absolute authority on this and other matters, on what the WHO treaty means for us and for the world. Neither was I joking when I said that just about the only people in Washington, D.C. That were not involved in Russian collusion were the Russians and Donald Trump. In the trial now unfolding in the United States, very serious allegations are being made under oath that point in the direction that not only was the whole Russiagate a hoax, a fabrication, fake from first to last, but that the author of it was Hillary Clinton, the then leader of the so-called Democratic Party and their candidate for president against Donald Trump. And still in the wings to emerge if Joe Biden trips over his dressing gown cord and chokes himself in the lavatory on one of his rushed visits. There's every possibility that Hillary Clinton is not dead, politically speaking. But the testimony given by close aides to her in court this week seems to suggest that Hillary Clinton got up the entire hoax herself. Some things are not in doubt at all. It is a matter of fact that the Hillary Clinton campaign paid for the so-called Steele dossier, which led the entire American state off on a wild goose chase at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars and total paralysis in their governmental system for at least the first half of Donald Trump's first presidency. It was all a hoax that the Democrats paid for. There was no Russian collusion. Trump was not a Manchurian candidate. The Russians did not interfere in the American elections. Now, humor me for a moment. Imagine everything I've just said there is 100% true, because it is. Just imagine the extent to which then we were all completely fooled. Indeed, people like me who were telling you that back then were called conspiracy theorists. Many of us were shadow banned, some of us banned from social media. We were told we were spreading Russian disinformation. And yet everybody now knows that what we were saying, once again, I'm afraid, was the truth. And what our enemies were saying, once again, I'm afraid, was a pack of lies. What can the United States do about this? Well, lock her up is a popular refrain, and it's never been closer. Hillary Clinton might have to go on trial for deliberately and via a conspiracy luring the FBI into a false witch hunt of the President of the United States and the officials round about him. It doesn't get much more dramatic than that. Now, as someone who cares nothing for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, here's the one person in this story that I, myself, am worried about. Julian Assange was falsely dragged into this Russiagate affair. He was falsely accused, not least on the front page of The Guardian, and the story is still there on The Guardian's web page. He was accused of being the primary disseminator of a so-called hack at the Democrat National Committee. A hack that was not a hack but a leak, was said to be funneled through Julian Assange from Moscow and other material through Julian Assange back to Moscow. Manafort was supposedly regularly visiting Julian Assange at the Ecuador embassy in London when he never set foot in the building, and Assange never set eyes on him. This Assange link to the Russiagate hoax was one of the prime movers of the Biden administration's frenzied attempt, to gain the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States, to face charges which will mean that we will never see his face again. Mind you, the reptilian Australian Prime Minister Morrison is no more. Words I can hardly contain myself in announcing. Not that I have any faith in the so-called Australian Labour Party, but my goodness, was I happy to see the so-called Liberals, actually Conservatives, down under, go under in a big way in the elections in Australia yesterday. Albanese as he's called, Albo, the new Prime Minister of Australia, is on record when leader of the opposition, demanding Assange be released from British custody and returned to his homeland in Australia. I beg him now, on air, live up to what you said, Prime Minister-elect, and get Julian Assange out of Belmarsh. Keep Julian Assange out of the clutches of the departing government in Canberra and out of the clutches of the United States of America. The Australian government should have done much more, didn't do hardly anything at all. Now is the opportunity for new leadership in Australia, and I wish them well. Advance, Australia, fair. We'll be talking to a former Australian senator, Professor Steve Keen, about the Australian elections in just a minute or two. Neither was I joking that the ruble, the much reviled, the multiply sanctioned ruble, oh, if only I had any rubles, if only it was legal for me to have any rubles, I'd be laughing, and so would you, because the ruble is now in 2022 the best performing currency in the world. This is important, not just for Schadenfreude, as the Germans might put it, although forgive me a little Schadenfreude, but because our economies in Europe are heading for the tank, heading for the drain, disappearing down the drain, whilst the Russian economy and its currency are booming. Your leaders, in the actions that they have taken, have caused your prices to rise and rise and rise, your currency to fall and fall and fall. Food shortages, which the former governor of the Bank of England described as likely to be apocalyptic. Now, when a central bank governor describes something as apocalyptic, you better sit up and take notice. He predicted that food shortages and food price rises would be of an apocalyptic scale. That's what your leaders have done, whilst the Russians have not just bounced off the floor, but are going into orbit, along with the Chinese economy, with which they are now inextricably twinned, in a BRICS alliance set to get larger, with more and more important economies joining it. The Shanghai Cooperation Trade Organization getting larger, in which half of the people of the world live and half of the wealth in the world is reposed. They're all going from strength to strength while we are disappearing down the toilet. And it isn't just Europe, although America has made sure that Europe pays the highest price. The people of the United States, the great people of the United States, from sea to shining sea, are themselves now entering a period of deep recession, which may become a depression. What will it take, people in the West, to ask the question of those who rule them? Whose side are you actually on? Is it you that's working for the Russians? Is it you that is Putin's stooge? Are you Manchurian candidates? Because you're wrecking our society and making his society ever more successful. Time only for one other issue, though many other issues will arise in the course of the show this evening. And that is the 5th anniversary of the Manchester Arena bomb attack on the Ariana Grande concert. I was in Manchester at that time, as I often am. I was 1 mile away when the dull thud of the murderous bomb exploded amongst a huge number of young children in the arena. It was a slaughter of the innocents. It was a massacre of our children. The mass murderer, the child killer, I'm not even going to mention his name. I spit upon his memory. Doesn't need to detain us now. He's burning in the hellfires for sure, as any deliberate mass murderer of children surely is. What should detain us here is the fact that nobody has been held to account for the systematic failures of intelligence, but also of policing and of emergency response that cost lives on the night. Let me deal only with the matter of the failures of intelligence. Anyone interested in politics and in any way connected to Manchester knew that there was a ticking time bomb in the existence in the city of a cell, a large cell of the Libyan Islamic fighting group. The clue was in the name. They were deliberately sent to Manchester and kept in Manchester in a cell formation. They were paid by successive British governments, Tony Blair's, Gordon Brown's, in fact, going all the way back to John Major's. as well as the Conservative governments of David Cameron and Theresa May. They were paid to be the Libyan Islamic fighting group waiting for their moment amongst the great people of the great city of Manchester. It was a time bomb that was ticking from the moment that these people were put there. The family of the mass murderer were one of the leading families in this Libyan Islamic fighting group cell. When the so-called revolution to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, the then leader of Libya, broke out, of course there was nothing spontaneous about its breakout, when the regime change operation in Libya, led by NATO, by Sarkozy, by Cameron, and by President Barack Obama, and the NATO top brass in their defensive role as head of a defensive NATO organization, launched their regime change operation in Libya. The family of the mass murderer were in the advance guard of those conveyed by the British state to go and fight and win in Libya. And then they were permitted, with the cordite still on their hands, with the explosive residue still in their clothes, to move back and forward between the killing fields of Libya and the great city of Manchester without let or hinder. No one stood in their way. Every facilitation of their passage to and from the front line was afforded by the British state. The mass murderer himself was reported to the authorities no less than, but maybe more than, 3 times. By his school, by his mosque, the Didsbury Mosque in Manchester, and by another individual, who all reported to the special branch in Manchester that this man was a dangerous fanatic who might well cause harm to the people of Manchester, and nothing was done about it. Now look, mistakes can happen. I'm not looking to witch hunt any individual or any individual service, but I demand accountability. And so should the Manchester MPs. And so should the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. We need to know how and why all of these blunders, disasters happened. The souls of the departed children of the Manchester Arena cry out for justice and accountability. I told you, fasten your seatbelts. This is the mother of all talk shows.
Let's play a game and I'll ask you yes or no questions. Ready? Okay then. Sick and tired of hearing the same old voices on the wireless? Are you looking for an alternative opinion to the mainstream media? Do you have a thing for a Scottish accent? If your answer is no to one or more of these questions, then you need the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway. Listen, watch, and share the fastest growing political program in the world.
It's for you, sir.
Where's the cheese pizza, Robinson? Come on, what are the public paying you for? Oh, and get another virgin Colado while you're there. There's a good chap. No, who's ringing the old burner phone. Hello? How did you get this number, Ghislaine? No, that's impossible. I can't possibly fly to New York. Why? Our mummy's grounded me. Oh, yes. Certain to cut off my allowance, you know. Yes, I know it comes from the public, but she holds the strings. Oh, I've got to go. My pizza will be here any minute. I'm not sweating, you're sweating. Ghislaine, don't call again. Robinson?
Sir.
Come here with that moist towelette. It's getting a bit hot for my liking.
Here? Where am I?
Welcome to St. Peter's Gate, my son.
Is this one of that Hillary's tricks, that devil?
Be still, my son. The Clintons cannot hurt you here. You are safe with me in heaven.
Oh, heck. Knew I shouldn't have taken Bob's homemade vaccine. Oh, Lord have mercy, I am not worthy.
Before you pass on, you may ask any question you desire.
Anything?
With my omniscient knowledge, I can tell you anything you wish to know.
Well, Lord, you gotta tell me. All-powerful creator of this universe, before you judge me, I've been searching for answers my whole life.
Yes, my child.
I have to know. Who shot JFK?
Another one. It was a lone gunman by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. He was not a government agent, and there was no second shooter on that grassy knoll in Dallas.
My God. This goes higher up than we thought.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
There's a poll running. Will Labour win the UK general election in 2024? Just like in Australia. My goodness, that's a complicated question. No idea who came up with that one. Will Labour win the UK general election in 2024? Just like in Australia. Sounds like a non sequitur to me, but that is the poll that has been set. You can vote on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube channel, or on my Telegram channel. Now, James Melville is my new favourite Scotsman. He was not my favourite before, and before that I had never heard of him. And then I got interested in the fact that a man that I'd never heard of, but who comes from a small town in the Nuke of Fife, just a few miles from where I was born and grew up, could be so eloquent, so erudite, so learned about issues which I was myself not particularly well informed about. So I looked more and more into his work, and I saw his following on social media grow and grow. And now I see that he has teamed up with someone else who wasn't my favorite person. I'll ask him about that in a minute for an important podcast, which I predict will do very well. He's an expert on many things, is Melville, and one of those is the World Health Organization Treaty. You may not yet have heard about that, but I promise you, you are going to. James Melville joins me now. James, thanks for coming back on the show. But before we turn to the WHO, have you got your monkeypox suit yet?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, anything for a fancy dress. I mean, basically, we're going through Project Fear again. I mean, it's like a Mobius loop of Project Fear. We go through the same cycles of another threat, more fear, more media manipulation, and then ultimately, more control. It's the same cycle again, but I'm willing to bet on this one, there's less people buying this particular cycle of fear.
Yeah, but a cycle of fear seems to be what they are determined to get up. I have seen multiple references to the monkeypox in just the last 48 hours. And it turns out, just like actually the coronavirus, that they war-gamed an outbreak of monkeypox just last year. Is that right?
Yeah, there is all of that. I mean, I'm trying to separate out the stuff that's actually, between fact and fiction. But I think what's happening with all this, and I say this right at the start of the pandemic, I bought into the first lockdown. I thought it was government ineptitude and panic, and we go along with it and see what happens. But pretty much by May 2020, I wasn't buying this because of the collateral damages that were stacking up. And then we got to vaccine passport and discrimination on medical choice. And then we go to the point that you touched on, the WHO. We don't know the details of what's coming down the tracks on this treaty, but it's stripping away two key things. It's stripping away basic individual choice and freedoms. And secondly, it's using fear to coerce people to go down that cycle of stripping away freedoms. Now we should, I say this as a Remainer campaigner, whereby I have a problem now where the model of globalization has massively changed to where it was after the post-war settlement in 1945, where it was set for ties that bind, to keep us secure, to increase trade routes, to collaborate, for good reasons. But it's become bastardized. It's now become completely out of sync to a point whereby it's stripping away control. And the worst thing about it is most of the public are completely unaware of what is happening in this cycle. And if we're not careful, we end up, say, with the next pandemic, whether it's monkeypox or something else, and we end up getting told what to do in terms of public health response by unelected technocrats based in Geneva, rather than the individual sovereign rights of states to decide what the response of a pandemic should be.
Well, that's right. It's a double whammy. It doesn't just strip personal sovereignty from the individual. It strips national sovereignty from the nation state. If you're in the WHO, if you sign up to this WHO treaty, your freedom to decide what to do about a future pandemic is null and void. It will be a globalized response, won't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's okay if you look at in one dimension about collaboration of information and research and, communication and data. That's okay. That's just sharing information. For me, as an internationalist, that's a good thing. We should be learning from our neighbors and collaborating. But that's very, very different to taking away laws and public health laws. One size does not fit all in a pandemic. If you look at, for instance, different responses, the diametrically opposite responses between Sweden and, say, Australia, you cannot have that broad brush approach coming down the tracks from the WHO. Now, I caveat that in the fact that we don't know what the meat and bones are of the treaty yet. It might just be about collaboration, but it's very ambiguous, some of the things they're saying. And interestingly enough, George, going back to basically the spring of 2021, the WHO started peddling this idea of a globalized treaty. And it was a circular that was sent across the world's media. There's 25 co-signatures to that memo that was put out to our media. One of them was Boris Johnson, which I think is somewhat ironic considering he was a self-styled freedom fighter to claw back sovereignty from unelected pesky bureaucrats in Brussels.
Yeah, take back control, only to hand it back again somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with Johnson. I mean, there's no consistency there. What he said about Brexit, again, I say this as a Remainer, what he said about Brexit, about taking back control, at the moment he's giving off the impression that he's giving away control, not just potentially to the WHO, but that also applied to SAGE as well. What we need, if a major issues of crisis or emergency or a virus, is we have to have the collaboration between the parliamentary democratic levers within our parliament and also consultation with the public. We vote for these bits of legislation. We vote governments to implement them. They might go in different directions from their manifesto, but it's still a democratic process, or they should be. But to get to a point where we risk giving up freedoms public health laws in whatever scale to the WHO is, I think, completely unacceptable. And I think they've got two aspects here that we need to try and inform people of. Firstly, that this potentially is coming down the track, so even over the next few days. And secondly, we need to have a conversation about where are we going in terms of our own democratic rights. For me, the pillar of society has to be about freedom. You should have the opportunity to protest, to strike, for freedom of movement. But certainly in terms of legislation, we cannot put ourselves at risk of basically the WHO, unelected technocrats, clawing away powers and democracy from 194 countries. That is completely unacceptable. But I do caveat the fact that we do not know what the details of the treaty are. But it is our obligation to try and make people aware that this is a risk, because most of our media simply aren't covering it.
No, they're not. That's why I wanted to speak to you on here about it. I mean, what's the best case scenario is, as you say, it's only about collaboration and information sharing and so on. What's the worst case?
Well, the worst case scenario is enforced lockdowns, vaccine passports, vaccine mandates. I mean, we've skirted with these issues, obviously, in the UK, not just from lockdown, which we went through, but also in terms of vaccine passports. UK government was perilously close to implementing that. And I suspect the only reason they didn't is because they were busted by their own party gates. You know, the only hospitality that was open during lockdown seemed to be down Downing Street. But we got perilously close to that. And so we're at a situation whereby if the treaty is about just collaboration, then fine. But if it starts being ambiguous and being open-ended to suggest that they will enforce lockdowns, despite the fact a future pandemic would have, in terms of different case levels and different mortality levels in different countries and different healthcare systems in different countries. And I used the example of Sweden versus Australia to show the compare and contrast. Or if we slip even further towards vaccine passports or vaccine mandates, that's not just about stripping away democracy. That's stripping away basic civil liberties. And it's a moral obligation, George, not just for our politicians to make sure that the WHO cannot claw back those powers, but also our media. And one or two of the media are talking about this. The information is out there, but the public at large are completely unaware of this. And we might end up sleepwalking into something that by the time the next pandemic comes around, whereby it's an enforcement from a third party that isn't elected, that takes away our civil liberties and our ability to have basic functioning form of freedoms, because we've lost the democratic sovereignty to make those decisions within our own sovereign states.
Now, I've become convinced that this Tedros, the head of the WHO, is a rum character. How do we get rid of him? How long is he there, scheduled to be there for? How can he be removed?
Yeah, but this comes back to what I was saying before, George, about how there's been a sort of mission creep in terms of the power and control from these technocratic organizations, of which I used to be a fan, because it was set up in good faith after 1945, the majority of them. But now it is going too far in terms of, it's not just about pulling levers, but when they start having control over effectively our public health policy, that's a massive issue. How do we get rid of them? Well, the starting point is we need to reshape our own domestic politics. We're at a situation now whereby if I look at the government, which I think is pretty much the worst government ever, combined with an opposition that's completely ineffective, you'd normally have within a cycle of the same government of 12 years, that the opposition have learnt a few things by then, and they're normally by that stage a government waiting. But we have the worst government and the worst opposition, the worst political party structure, probably in living memory in this country, at exactly the worst time. And I think we need something new. I think the public have switched off from party politics, but the dangerous thing is, by switching off and showing apathy, it bizarrely, paradoxically, gives more control for these political organizations, but they're not fit for purpose, they're not connecting with people. Look at the cost of living crisis. No one's providing solutions. Now, if we have a double whammy of technocrats taking away our freedoms in an advent of an emergency under the auspice of staying safe, or it's for your own good. And actually the phrase "it's for your own good" is the mantra of every authoritarian regime in history. Combined with ineffectual party politics, what's left for the public? Where do the public feel that they're getting help and support? And so we've now got a situation whereby people are desperately looking to their political leaders to solve this huge set of crises that are coming down the tracks. But there's no one there, and that's a major problem.
James, just briefly, tell us where people can find you next. I mentioned your new podcast that's coming out. That looks tasty.
It's annoyed all the right people. So we've put it together over the last few weeks. We've done quite a few of the podcasts with a lot of good guests. There's more coming down the tracks. Now, Isabel's a perfect example of what I believe, and I'm a big believer in bipartisanship. That's why we've started speaking again, George. But it's because Isabel and I had different opinions on Brexit. We squabbled a lot over it, but we came together over the response on COVID, and we had a huge issue with some of the collateral damages around that. And I think it's a healthy thing that someone who... Politics makes strange bedfellows sometimes. And I'm a great believer that you can learn from some of the different opinions and also collaborate and work with them. So Isabel and I are good friends. We set up this podcast. It's all about scrutinizing authoritarianism and a sort of call to arms to claw back our freedoms. The first set of podcasts are largely about finance and digital currency and digital ID, and then we'll have wider aspects in future runs. But I think it's important sometimes for people to get their heads out of their echo chambers and start working with people who've got different opinions, because if you only work with people who've got the same opinions, you're not going to achieve much. You know, people have to learn. I mean, if you take the example of me and you, George, we were on the same side we were anti-austerity, and we had a different opinion about Corbyn's approach over Brexit. But here we meet again in terms of the response on COVID, and that's a good thing.
As Mrs. Thatcher said, it's a funny old world, James. Good luck with Isabel Oakeshott in your new double act, and thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Let me take a quick break.
Yeah, hi, George. The deep state, we mentioned it before. So rather than fear-mongering that everything that's going on at the moment with the COVID, the wars, blah, 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 why aren't we all addressing the deep state rather than this fear-mongering that's going over and over again?
How do you address it?
What I'm trying to get across, and hopefully your listeners will understand this, there is a deep state at work, and you know that.
Everybody knows that. That's a statement of the bleeding obvious.
So let's do something about that. Rather than ratting and rolling about the...
Give us a lead. Be our leader. Be our leader, Del.
Who are the deep states?
Yeah.
Oh, what a brilliant question. Those that are all over us. And what should we do about them? We should make them accountable.
I'm just trying to work out whether you're in the territory of shape-shifting lizards, or you're talking about MI5 and MI6.
Please don't turn it into a circus, George. You know full well what's going on, and please don't.
I do. I'm just struggling to get from you what it is we should be doing about them. What should I do about MI5 and MI6, and how should I do it?
Just stand up and go, there's something inherently wrong here. And
there's something really wrong here. There you are. I've sorted it, Del. Thanks for the call.
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows with George Galloway.
Okay, that double-header poll. Will Labour win the UK general election in 2024, comma, just like in Australia? Yes, 27% on Twitter. No, 73% on Twitter. On YouTube, yes, 43%. No, 57%. And on my Telegram channel, yes, 36%. No, 64%. You can vote for the next hour or more, and I hope that you will. Now, you may have noticed that I didn't ask you for money. I first want to thank each and every person who donated. You know who you are, and everyone else will soon know, because you will be immortalized in a roll of honor of those who kept the mother of all talk shows afloat when virtually all financial props were kicked away from us. And we would have gone out of business. We would have gone off the air if it were not for your support. So I'll forever be deeply grateful to you. I'll forever be a little bit bitter for those of you who didn't give. Different if you're just watching us on clips, maybe you're unaware of the financial emergency that we passed through. Although I find that hard to believe, it's possible. But if you are, and half our audience is, following the stream, so watching the whole show, then it's pretty inexcusable that when I badly needed you, you didn't come through, even with $1 or £1. Unless you are in absolute dire poverty, I find that hard to forgive. But we do have, as I predicted last week, we would have a sponsor for the Sunday show. You can still give to get your name on the Roll of Honor, and you can still give so that we can relaunch the Wednesday night midweek MOATS. I'd very much like to get back to that. And the means of donation are coming up on the screen. You can vote. Perhaps you can give perhaps more easily than on any other way on Super Chat on YouTube. You just go to the Super Chat function on YouTube. And by the way, I hope you've subscribed to my YouTube channel. Go to Super Chat, make a donation. You can even make it recurrent if you like, and it will get to us very, very quickly indeed, far quicker than any other means. But you can also donate through the website, moats.tv /donate, okay? So it's moats.tv, that's the website, and go to the donate function. But the Sunday show is now secure. We will not be going off the air, touch wood, God willing. Although we may have to look at some emergency summer arrangements, and we will have the return of some old favourites from time to time sitting in my chair. Now, can I get my second guest up, please? It's Kayla Popuchet, was on my television show and has been on MOATS before. A first-class guest from the Pulitzer Center. She's a fellow of the Pulitzer Center and the Queensborough Coordinator in the Queens County Civil Court. Kayla, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. I'll tell you why I wanted to talk to you in particular was about medical costs in the United States, because I was following the things that you were saying about it. And that's important, of course, if you're in the United States, but it's important also if you're in the United Kingdom, because your system of healthcare is ineluctably crawling across the Atlantic Ocean. So what you're about to talk to us about may very well be the reality here in Britain in the years to come. So welcome back to the show, and just bring viewers up to date with what you've been saying about health costs in the United States, would you?
Absolutely. And as you said before, that this may be slowly creeping across the Atlantic, I'm going to tell you, I don't wish this upon our worst enemy, no matter what. This is absolutely something that the people of Europe and everywhere in the world should absolutely stand against, because the United States, as many know, is one of the world's most wealthiest countries. This is a very developed country, and yet it is the country that spends the highest amount in healthcare costs. Its people are spending the highest amount. The medical industry in the United States has reached $4.1 trillion this year alone, which has only gotten worse due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as we are the country that's also been the worst affected by that. Also, in part due to our medical system and the fact that the pandemic management was privatized under Obama and Trump's administration. And so you have a country of nearly 400 million, where nearly 400 million are spending $12,000 a year per person just on medical costs alone. And so it's absolutely a travesty. Now we're facing a shortage on baby formula. And as you know, this is also going to contribute to a new epidemic within the country, where babies will now need to be hospitalized because they don't have access to food. And so if you think about it, with the reports showing that there's 3 days in a hospital in the United States could cost you about $30,000. So what does this mean for a country of 400 million? This means going into GoFundMe and asking for money. This means trying to raise money within your local community for applying for programs. Millions of people go bankrupt every year in the United States because they don't have access to medical care, a basic necessity of any country, which is something Europeans have been able to be afforded, but is slowly going to creep into our system, is creeping into yours. And so again, I wouldn't wish this on anybody else. There are millions of people who go without medical care because they cannot afford it. Deaths, unnecessary deaths happen every single year in this country because our government chooses to, instead of putting in the medical care for all, which would create a single payer medical system, completely wiping out the private companies that profit off of the illnesses of human beings. Instead of that, they choose to compete with them with the implementation of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. So it's absolutely a travesty. It's a very dangerous situation in this country, and it's completely backwards.
Well, we'll come back to the baby formula because that is another story that intrigues me greatly. But sticking with the money, first of all, I'm glad you pointed it out, because a lot of people will think from the state of affairs in the US, where tens of millions of Americans had no health insurance at all, that the problem is a shortage of money. But as you've just explained, the value of, sounds perverse to use that word, the financial value of the health industry in the United States is $4 trillion, more than $4 trillion. The average spend is therefore $12,000 a head being spent on healthcare. So you are spending more money on health than anybody else and achieving worse outcomes for the ordinary people, for the ordinary Joe and Joanne, worse outcomes for more money. I mean, how does that even stack up?
I think about the Affordable Care Act, and so I get insurance personally through my employer. And my employer does cover part of it, taking out of my taxes from my paychecks every 2 weeks. So yes, we all spend about, even if you are covered by health insurance, you are spending more money than you really should if you were in Europe or in other countries where there is a single payer healthcare system. And the root problem is that it is an extremely profitable system. People will always need access to medical care. This has been something since the beginning of times with apothecaries and witch doctors. People will always need access to medical care. So it's a sustainable industry that's been extremely privatized. And now we have bipartisan, because I don't want us to confuse with the Democrats who are pushing single payer medical care or the Republicans. Both parties in the United States Congress have stocks in private insurance companies and are making it extremely profitable for the rich who have those stocks, who have access to these insurances companies, and the heads of these insurance companies seeking the money out and sucking it out of the American people who have no choice but to sometimes even access medical care. And I will tell you, George, I don't think this is something that is spoken about a lot, but I personally know people who go to doctors that work under the table. So they won't charge it through your insurance. They won't even, they'll work from their home offices, they'll work from their homes, they have their own medical supplies there, and they'll pay maybe $200 instead of paying a $1,600 root canal, for example. So there's becoming now an even underground industry of medical care because it is just extremely unaffordable. And you can't imagine that this would exist in any other developed or first world country, that there's an underground market to seek medical care, profiting, becoming increasingly profitable as well. And so you have this absolute travesty happening within the country where people are being sucked out of their money for these private insurances, paying for high premiums, or they go towards the Obamacare or Affordable Care Act options where you have horrible health care coverage. There's very little doctors that will accept that type of insurance. And another thing that the Affordable Care Act also covers is Medicaid. So there's often the saying that if you are so poor that you can't afford to pay into healthcare insurance, then you can get Medicaid. But the reality is, for places like New York City, where the minimum wage is $15, if you're working full time and you make $15 an hour, you don't even reach the federal poverty line as a single person. You don't. Even though you're making $30,000 a year when you can't afford anything, and you likely have 2 jobs, you are not considered poor. Therefore, you cannot access Medicaid. So what do? You get penalized by the government when you file your taxes. And right now we're in tax season time. You get penalized by the government for not having insurance, but you also can't afford insurance. And so these are a lot of the people who are going into the underground medical care system as well, especially for people who don't have access to vision and dental care. Because it's not all one thing, by the way. It's medical is solely for your body. If you need dental, that's a separate type of insurance. If you need vision care, that's a separate type of insurance. It's extremely profitable. It's bipartisan profitability as well. Bipartisan politicians are getting stocks and making money off of the privatization of our healthcare system while Americans are going into bankruptcy. They're begging for money. And, once again, we'll go talk about the baby formula, but we're asking Europe for money for baby formula. You can't imagine that this is a developed country. We often say this is a first world country, or actually a third world country in a Gucci belt.
Kayla, we're out of time, alas. We'll have to come back to the baby food issue perhaps next week, because I think a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic are extremely confused of how the world's leading economy, the most powerful country in the world, can possibly have a situation where there isn't enough baby formula for the declining number of babies that your country is producing. I can't quite understand it myself. Kayla Popuchet, thanks for joining us. I apologize if there's a problem with audio for the audience. There certainly is for me. I heard Kayla's words in triplicate throughout that interview. They were good the first and second times. It got a bit wearing the third times. The poll is still running. Will Labour win the UK general election in 2024, just like in Australia? You can vote yes or no on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube channel, and on my Telegram channel. If you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe. I'm that close to 200,000 subscribers. I'm appealing to you to subscribe to my YouTube channel because I'm determined to get that plaque out of YouTube that they still never delivered to me for my first 100,000. Now, my good wife and I were recently in Belgrade. Amongst many other important things that we did, we finally got to go and see Red Star Belgrade, one of my favourite football teams in the world. Well, when you're a Manchester United supporter, you do have to cast around in the world to find alternatives that make you cheer. They won 8-0. But that wasn't my main reason for being in Belgrade. Gayatri and I were out and about. looking at some of the handiwork of that well-known defensive organization, NATO. Take a look at this. My good wife Gayatri and I have recently returned from Belgrade in Serbia. It's the first time I've been in Belgrade since the war launched by Tony Blair and Bill Clinton to complete the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1999. We found it a fascinating remnant of a once great country. Yugoslavia was a success story. It was a popular, for a long time, socialist country, innovative and attractive, and one which attracted holidaymakers even from all over the West. Yugoslavia was socialism in different colors from traditionally seen. Yugoslavia was a unity of 5 peoples, and those 5 peoples were encouraged, no, pushed over decades to splinter and break up. The BBC in London at Bush House had no less than 4 language stations beaming exclusively into Yugoslavia, seeking to arouse the serpents of sectarianism and separatism to break up this successful country, whose leader, Tito, was amongst the greatest of all the socialist leaders. An anti-fascist commander in Spain in the Civil War 1936 to 1939, the leader of the partisans in Yugoslavia, who liberated themselves from Nazi occupation and throughout the war tied down multiple divisions of the Nazi Wehrmacht, and the builder of a type of socialism which stood the test of time, at least while he was alive. Tito was a Croat, and he was leading the state of Yugoslavia from Belgrade, the capital now of Serbia. We visited his grave, a very tasteful and powerful monument to what once was. But there's no point in crying over spilt milk. Yugoslavia is gone, perchance for good. But what I'm here to talk to you about, and the video you're about to see will show what happened the last time NATO got involved in a war in Europe. Teenage scribblers, and many of them far older than teenage scribblers, routinely describe NATO as a defensive alliance. They frequently say that NATO has kept the peace in Europe since the end of the Second World War. But you can only believe that if you have forgotten the nearly 3 months that NATO bombers bombarded a European capital, the great and ancient city of Belgrade, the ruins of which can still be seen by visitors, of whom there are, alas, comparatively few, and by the citizens of Belgrade on a daily basis. We routinely hear, in relation to the Ukraine, that the borders of a European country cannot be altered by force. But you can only believe that to be true if you've never heard of Kosovo. Kosovo was and is legally a part of Serbia. The other Yugoslav republics seceded, as they had the right to do in a federal state. But Kosovo was not a state. It was and is a part of Serbia, a sacred part at that for the believers in Orthodox Christianity, the very clear majority of the people of Serbia. Kosovo was forcibly seized by NATO, who dismembered Serbia. Not content with breaking up and destroying Yugoslavia, they then destroyed Serbia, the last remaining part of Yugoslavia. There would be nothing called Kosovo if it was not an armed NATO encampment. It has no resources. It has exported a massive proportion of its population as immigrant workers elsewhere in the European continent, as well as most of the guns that turn up in crime in the European continent, most of the drugs that turn up in the European continent, and most, alas, of the prostitutes who end up on the European continent. Kosovo has been reduced to sink status because the Western powers that created it have no interest in it except as a means of breaking up Serbia and besieging what remains of Yugoslavia. They don't care about Kosovo. They don't care about Albanian people. They cared only, for lots of reasons, about keeping the Serbian people, if not in their camp, then simply unable to do anything vis-à-vis Russia, for example, that their camp did not approve of. The Serbian people are particularly close to the Russian people. We attended the Cup semi-final, won 8-0 by Red Star Belgrade, and all the flags amongst the crowd, amongst the ultras, were Russian flags, chants of Russia. Smoke pillars of red, white, and blue were constantly arising from the crowd. Russia's very popular in Serbia for religious reasons, but also for historical reasons. The Yugoslav partisans were fighting alongside Russia, and indeed alongside Britain and America, against the Nazi occupation of their country. That's all been forgotten about by Britain and the United States, that don't even invite the Russians to the victory celebrations. Germany is more welcome at World War II victory commemorations now than the Red Army, which did far, far more than anybody else, everybody else put together, to bring about that defeat of Nazi Germany. But the people of Serbia have never forgotten that wartime alliance. They haven't forgotten that Russia refuses to recognize the forced unilateral independence of Kosovo. But here's the rub. Almost everyone else has recognized it. A state was forcibly torn from its own motherland and unilaterally recognized by the football authorities, by the Eurovision Song Contest, by international fora, and by the big powers in the West, by the British, the United States, the French, the Germans, and so on. Which begs one final question. If Kosovo can be taken by force and created into statehood without the agreement of the people whose land it forms part of, why cannot the Crimea? Why cannot the Donbass? Why cannot Mariupol? Why cannot the entire eastern part of the Ukraine? If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. If it's good for Kosovo, it's good for the Ukraine. Take a look at this video. They were partying like it was 1999. In fact, it was in 1999 when peaceful NATO were partying here in a European capital, the city of Belgrade. They tell you that NATO is a defensive organization. Tell that to the people of former Yugoslavia. Tell that to the people of Belgrade. For almost 3 months that they were bombing and killing here in the heart of Europe. NATO is, as it has always been, a front for the American empire. If you're supporting it, you're acting against the interests of the people of Europe. You're acting in the interests of the continuing domination of the globe by the United States of America. They even bombed the Chinese embassy here in 1999. They silenced a television station, not by ordnance, but yes, by ordnance of the exploding kind. They killed 16 employees of the state radio and television, the equivalent of the BBC in Belgrade, including makeup ladies and tea ladies. They did so in order to complete the destruction and the dismemberment of the former Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Nobody much said or did anything against it, in Britain or in Europe as a whole. Myself, in Parliament, it's a period of which I'm inordinately proud. Under the leadership of the late Mr. Benn, Tony Benn, the greatest Prime Minister we never had, we fought a rearguard action in Parliament against the destruction of Yugoslavia. We failed, like we failed again just a few years later in Iraq. But the world has changed. Nobody can bomb a Chinese embassy now. Nobody can stand up to the new Eurasian development which is taking place on this planet, where most of the people and most of the wealth of the planet resides. We're in a new world. It's just not the new world order that the so-called West, which is, I remind you, just 10% of the world's population, think or thought that it was going to be. Their new world order has been stillborn. A better world order, a more just world order, is in the process of being born. But these are useful reminders of just exactly the nature of the beast that is NATO. We're here in Belgrade and we can say these things without fear of seizure of our assets, without fear of imprisonment. 7 years in prison. If I was to say what I've just said through the mediums that would reach a large number of people, I could end up next door to Julian Assange. Just think. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to be doing these shorts every week because we can't run a news bulletin anymore because of government sanctions. We can't get access to the cheap or free video and stills that we used to use to present the news bulletin to you. The government works in mysterious ways, or perhaps not that mysterious. Next week I'll be producing and bringing to you a short about the birth of war propaganda, war atrocity propaganda, from the graveside of the man that invented it. I promise you, you're going to be very surprised. The poll's still running on my Twitter account, on my YouTube channel, and on my Telegram channel, which is t.me/George Galloway. Don't forget to follow me on Patreon, where there's a real blockbuster coming up about my trip to the Senate. Mr. Galloway goes to Washington 17 years ago last week. My, how time has flown. It was, I think, most people would agree, a rather significant event. And I was accompanied throughout by my oldest friend, Ron Mackay, who's the editor of this show and who was sat next to me in the US Senate. And we've been reminiscing about the amazing day or 2 days that took place when Mr. Galloway went to Washington. So you'll be able to see that kind of mini documentary, just like the Maxwell one, on my Patreon channel, patreon.com/George Galloway. The one and only Garland Nixon is up next. Let's hear from Garland. Garland, you are a radio talk show host and a political analyst of the first rank, so you'll be able to answer, I think, this first question. Is Hillary Clinton bound for jail?
No, to be quite frank, I don't think that I put it like this. I'm not one of the people who has confidence that the Durham investigation is on the up and up. We have found out this week, well, I'll put it like this. Something that we already know was reinforced in that Hillary Clinton was in the midst of the Russiagate hoax. During the trial of one Michael Sussman, who was a lawyer for the Clinton campaign, who went to the FBI with some false information about Trump and Russia, one of many people who did that. He has been charged with lying to the FBI in that we are to believe that the FBI didn't know that a Clinton campaign lawyer whom they had previously worked with as a Clinton campaign lawyer wasn't a Clinton campaign lawyer. Somehow they must have forgotten it between the first time they worked with him when he was working with on the DNC servers and after that. But at any rate, so apparently an FBI agent at some point during the trial did testify that Hillary Clinton, no, it wasn't an FBI agent. In fact, it was the one and only Robbie Mook, who was one of Hillary's close associates and confidants. It admitted that Hillary Clinton herself did give the green light for releasing the information, the false information about the alleged server that tied Donald Trump to some Russian whoever. That was never quite clear who he was talking to in Russia. But at any rate, I just don't have any confidence that John Durham is going to tell the truth here, which is that the FBI was knee-deep in this, that they were actually part of the operation rather than a victim of false information, as seems to be implied thus far.
Yes, I mean, it's a useful exculpatory maneuver by the FBI to hold up their arms like the gendarme officer in Casablanca and say how shocked they are that the Clinton campaign was involved in wasting their time and their money and resources in a false, through a false set of accusations. But when you think of the actual cost of the Russiagate hoax, it was not just boiled down to the wasted police time of the FBI, is it? It paralyzed your country for at least 2 years and arguably has disfigured your country's politics until this day.
I would agree, and I think it was an integral part of the foreign policy of the United States as executed by our the blob, which is a combination of a political, economical, and deep state machine that directs our politics. I think the biggest part of the Russiagate hoax was to, or actually the Russiagate operation, was to ensure that Donald Trump was not able to do any of the things that he wanted to do regarding possibly withdrawing or reconfiguration of NATO and of some manner of détente or rapprochement with Russia. And I think it was to create an environment where he had to constantly push back of how tough he was on Russia. I think it was very, very successful. And now, of course, the investigation will continually show that the FBI was somehow victimized by person after person, that at the same time, at exactly the same time that we are to believe that the FBI was being lied to, that a Clinton attorney was hiding from the FBI, that he worked for Clinton, for the Clintons. At exactly the same time, the FBI was hiding from a FISA court that the Steele dossier was produced by the Clintons. So if, in fact, John Durham is going to charge Michael Sussman with hiding from the FBI, that he was an operative, a paid operative for the Clinton campaign, shouldn't he also be charging someone from the FBI who was signing off on court warrants and doing exactly the same thing, hiding that the Steele dossier was also paid for by the Clinton campaign?
What is amazing is that, at least until now, there's no holding to political account of what can only be described as a criminal conspiracy that turned the world upside down, certainly turned the United States upside down. If there had been no Russiagate operation, there would have, I think, not been a Trump defeat, if defeat it was, and there would have been a Trump second term. There would have been no January 6th. There would have been probably no war in the Ukraine at this point in time. The costs are cataclysmically high, and yet no one is paying with their political scalp for all this.
I think what happened actually in that Hillary Clinton didn't win in 2016 was it postponed the plans of this machine that it intended on creating this crisis in Ukraine. They planned on doing it. They had overthrown the government of Ukraine in 2014. Hillary was to come in 2016, and she was to execute this plan where they would launch an assault on the Donbass and then draw Russia in, and then, of course, do what they really wanted to do, which is wipe out the European economy. I mean, let's be honest, the United States empire wants to detach the European economy from cheap energy, from reasonably priced commodities that they can get from Russia, and wipe out their economy so they're no longer economic competition, and so they're under full control. So it just, well, I'll put it like this. The European citizens got a few more years before their economy gets yanked out from under them. The sad thing, I think, here is that I still see people in Europe and in the United States who are flying a blue and yellow flag, or Zelensky, some kind of hero, and they don't understand that they are being sacrificed at the altar of this neocon world conquest imperialist project.
Quite, although it's rapidly falling out of favor now. You still see these flags, but far fewer than before. My neighbor, a few miles from here, was one of the first to fly a Ukrainian flag outside their cottage, but it's long come down and been replaced by a Scottish flag. The show is coming to a close, at least here in my part of the world. I don't know about yours, but that's for a number of reasons. First of all, the war is not being won by the NATO side, and we'll come on to that, I hope. Secondly, the economic cost of our involvement in that NATO-Russia war is beginning to heave into view, and it's not a pretty sight. And third, the true nature of the Ukrainian regime brought to power in this coup in 2014 is becoming clearer to people. Is none of that happening in the US yet?
In fact, all of those things are happening in the U.S. There's a great question about the $40 billion that has been approved to go to the Ukrainian crisis. Americans are very upset about that at the time that we've got any number of baby food formula, crisis. We've got an issue with the cost of energy going through the roof. So Americans are coming to the realization that they have literally adopted a country, and that this $40 billion is only supposed to last until September, and that the United States now is literally paying for the civil servants and paying for the health care for people in Ukraine. So that's definitely coming to a head. The other thing I think that is important here, and this is being discussed, and that is that we had a massacre where a shooter in Buffalo, a young 18-year-old white male, went into a supermarket and killed a bunch of black people, and he had a black sun emblem, the exact same black sun emblem that the Azov battalion wears. And that connection is being made, that discussion is being had, and the U.S. government and the U.S. media media is working hard to push back on that, but it's not having any effect. The discussion is being had all over, and it's again, it's enlightening people to the reality that the United States is supporting a Nazi regime, a neo-Nazi regime. At the same time, they're hypocritically saying that they're opposing neo-Nazi white supremacy and all that kind of stuff at home.
Yeah, you've taken the words right out of my mouth. The US is the only country in the world where you can deplore endlessly, tearfully on television, white supremacy at home, whilst arming and funding the very same supremacist ideology in the Ukraine.
Absolutely, and it's really the discussion. I think that's something that I think here in the United States is going to be a problem over the long run. I don't think they thought this out, or rather, I'll put it like this: I think the people in power have gotten away with this, in that they've supported ISIS, they've supported these extremist, violent organizations for so many years, and they've gotten away with it. But in the United States, the issue of Nazis, it was like a pride in the United States that the greatest generation fought against the Nazis, fought against the fascists. They were legitimately demonized. And now people are quite upset and concerned that they're lionizing the Azov battalion as some kind of, great fighters and heroes. And the concern is, particularly with what happened with this 18-year-old boy, that young people want heroes. They want to be a superhero. And when you start telling young people, look at these guys, they're superheroes, they're great fighters, they are the toughest people, these young people are going to start going online. They're going to start finding out what these people are about. And their government has told them that those people are superheroes. Why wouldn't they want to imitate a superhero? So once again, the chickens are coming home to roost in the United States. The problem is these people are going to want to shoot Jews and black people and Muslims and people in trade unions, and those are the people that are going to be first in front of the firing squad, and those are the groups that the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, expects to support him first.
I'm glad you brought up Buffalo. I wish I could unsee what I did see from the live streaming of the event. It was truly devastating, especially when one learns that the mass murderer was only 18 years old. How does an 18-year-old boy get that kind of powerful automatic weaponry and protective equipment that stopped him being stopped short when the very brave former police officer, then supermarket security guard, actually hit him with, I think, one round, maybe two, which would ordinarily have stopped him in his tracks, but he was wearing armor, which blocked the security guard's weapons. How does that happen, Garland? Talk us through in the rest of the world where such a thing is unimaginable.
Well, here in the United States, there are gun shows where people can literally go to a gun show and they don't have to fill out any paperwork, and they can buy a high-powered rifle. It's the chickens coming home to roost. Bad news for the people of Europe. You're going to experience the same thing. The United States, for profit, pumps huge amounts of military-grade weapons into its own population. The National Rifle Association used to get almost all of their money from their members. Now it gets 70 to 80% of its money from the arms manufacturers. So the arms manufacturers simply see the United States as a market, and they do everything they can to pump military-grade weapons into our community. But guess what? They're doing the same thing, probably far worse, in Ukraine, and sadly to Nazis. Once again, people with the same black sons are going to be marching around Europe with high-grade military weapons, and I think the chickens that are roosting in the United States, unfortunately, are going to come home to roost in many parts of Europe also.
Now, one read often about some unhinged, crazed manifesto that this 18-year-old mass murderer had published, but none of us have been allowed to read what it said. You're a former police officer, a retired police captain. You are a former member of the American Civil Liberties Union. You're a well-informed journalist. What motivated this 18-year-old to do this heinous act?
You know, when we look at this, there is some history. We see this time and again. This is a young man who had a history of some level of mental illness. This is apparently this is a young man who had been picked up in the past for making threats in his high school to do similar things. So this is a person that had a track record that pointed to a reality in which he may some way act out in this manner. I think the problem is that two problems. Number one, it wasn't followed up on but even more importantly, as we keep discussing, it is far too easy for people to get their hands on military-grade weapons in the U.S. And, of course, the United States is lionizing neo-Nazis and violent extremists time and again. And I believe that the combination of this, whatever mental illness this child had, his propensity towards violence, and certainly, I don't think it's an accident that at the exact same time the United States is lionizing people who are running around goose-stepping, screaming Sig Heil, that this guy should suddenly figure out that that's the direction he wants to go in, and that he wants to dress like them and act like them. I truly believe that this will not be the last instance of the United States of Azov-style violence. So let's not forget the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand had claimed that he had been to Ukraine and had the exact same black sun symbol. I think we are seeing, just as a few years, we remember we saw all the stabbings and all of the violence from ISIS and the Manchester bombing, etc. Once again, the violence and the foreign policy of the U.S. empire is visiting itself among its citizens in both violence and, unfortunately, in economic disaster, which is a whole nother story.
Last point, and I'm grateful, Garland, as always. Where is Trump in all this? Is he nursing his wrath to keep it warm? Is he ready to unleash it on the American political scene? Has he decided whether he's going to run in 24 or not?
You know, at this point, 2024 is a long time off. Again, Joe Biden, who seems not to even know what planet he's on right now, claims that he's going to run in 2024. Donald Trump is not coming out and saying that he will, but he's staying very much involved in domestic politics and national politics. The interesting thing is, recently Donald Trump made a statement about the Ukraine conflict and basically implied that his position was that it should be resolved through diplomatic means. Noam Chomsky came out and actually said the only statesman in the West who has a reasonable position on this is Donald Trump. So I believe that as this thing goes bad, particularly the economics in the U.S., the economics in Europe goes bad, Donald Trump will be poised to win a Reagan-esque 48 states should he choose to run against Joe Biden or God forbid, Kamala Harris.
Garland Nixon, as always, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Very, very wise man is Garland. The poll is bad news for Labour in the UK. Yes, 26% think that UK Labour will emulate their sister party in Australia and win the next election. But 74% say no. And on my YouTube channel, it's 43 say yes, 57 say no. So YouTube is better for Keir Starmer, but not very much better. And on my Telegram channel, yes, 36%, no, 64%. Give me a 2-minute break, count them. Talk TV, it was years in the making. It hired, I've no doubt, at a salary in the millions, Piers Morgan as its frontman. It has completely flopped, like all of the sofa politics television in Britain. Far too many of them singing exactly the same song, interviewing exactly the same people, taking exactly the same line on every matter, from domestic to international. The reason that our numbers are exponentially larger than a multi-million-pound operation run out of Rupert Murdoch Towers we are different, but we are free to speak our minds. Nobody tells us what to think or what to say. That goes for me. It goes for my far more interesting guests. Amongst English-speaking people around the world, this show is completely unique. But it's an endangered species. Some people have been incredibly kind and generous, giving far more than we ask for. So if you are, and you know who you are, amongst those who've given really generously, then please take a holiday. Don't keep giving. Because I'm after that big audience, and I'm asking you only for $1. Is this show not worth $1? You don't have to buy a license fee and get sent to jail if you don't to watch the mother of all talk shows. I'm asking for $1 or £1 if you are in Britain, or €1 if you are in Ireland or elsewhere in the European Union.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
Let's go to the phone lines. Brian is in Canada. Let's hear from Brian first up. Go ahead, Brian. What would you like to say? Brian, you're on the air. We've lost Brian, it would appear. Shall we go to Los Angeles? I'd kind of rather go to Los Angeles than Canada. No disrespect to my Canadian friends. I see Jason Kenney is no longer the Prime Minister of Alberta. So all my enemies are falling one by one. As Ho Chi Minh said, if you stand by the banks of the river for long enough, the bodies of all of your enemies will float by. I had a few enemies in Canada, but many friends. Let's see if we've connected with Brian. Go ahead, Brian. What would you like to say? Well, I'm writing off Brian. Can we go to Kyle in Los Angeles? Is that possible? Let's see if we can go to Los Angeles. Kyle, are you there?
And we're going from the Israeli-Arab conflict. Now we're in Russia.
Yeah, go on.
George?
Is this Kyle?
Hello, George. George.
Yeah, who am I talking to?
I'm here, George. Hello, George.
Who are you?
George.
Who are you?
What's going on here?
Can we get rid of both of these
Brian
callers? Because this is technically catastrophic. So here are the numbers. If you're in the United Kingdom, it's entirely free. 08081 965522. That's 08081 965522. It's completely free of charge. You call us, we'll call you back and put you on the show, unlike Brian and Kyle. And if you're in the United States or Canada for that matter, it's also toll free. It will cost you nothing at all. It's +1 844 944 3344. Or you can email the show anytime at onair@moats.tv. I'm not sure if we've got any of these callers because I have lost contact with the mothership. Let's try Kyle in Los Angeles. Go ahead, Kyle.
Hello, George. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Very clear. Go ahead.
Oh, very good. I was sorry your last caller wasn't able to get in, but I'll take his place. First of all, it is an honor to speak with you, sir, and I'll just briefly say that it was your brilliant statements during the run-up to the Iraq War that caught my attention. In Parliament, you made a fantastic case against the Tony Blair invasion. This was an awful thing that happened, of course, the equivalent of the Vietnam War, which I remember well, being of a certain age. So thank you for your sanity, if I may.
Thank you, Kyle. Most kind of you. And I was thinking a lot about that issue because it was the 17th anniversary of my Senate appearance. They never did ask me back, but they did mean that I obtained an audience in the United States, and you are a treasured part of that. What would you like to say about Hillary Clinton?
Well, this is a sore subject with me because I have written about her extensively. And, well, not that extensively, but enough to make me nauseous when I think about it. She is, of course, as you say, still a possibility to return to power. And should that happen, I'll have to flee the country immediately. A cheap statement that is often made by people in my situation. But my problem is I've not been able to vote in my country. And by that, I mean not stomach the idea of voting because I am apparently neither a Republican or a Democrat. The Democrats have turned, especially since the election of Barack Obama. And I am in mind of Hillary Clinton's statement when she was Secretary of State. And I urge anyone who has not seen this particular YouTube clip to view it by Googling, we came, we saw, he died, referring to the leader of the sovereign state of Libya. And that, of course, was Gaddafi. It's pronounced differently, but that's how I'm pronouncing it in any case. So her cackle afterwards is absolutely chilling. If we're to expect to have the leader of the State Department of the United States gloating over the killing of a head of state, then I am quite disturbed to be a citizen of that state. So that, in brief, encapsulates my concerns about Hillary Clinton.
Well, it may have been brief, Kyle, but it was unbelievably powerful. And so I've only got one question for you. To what do you attribute her enduring appeal? How can she possibly still be in the mix for power in Washington, D.C.? She was soundly beaten by Donald Trump, who at the time seemed the most outlandish possible rival.
Yes.
Indeed, she did everything she could to make sure that he was going to be the rival. She positively tried to make him her rival. She was soundly beaten. And now she's back in the mix 6 years later. All that cackling, all that killing later. How do you explain it?
Unfortunately, partisan politics in the United States for all of my life has been an exercise in cults. Both the Republican partisans and the Democrats as well are a member of what can only be termed as a cult type of belief system or organization in which they are at each other's throats to the death, and yet the people who are benefiting from this, these two cults going head to head, are having a very good laugh at the public's expense. The Democrats who live where I am from, which is Los Angeles, are particularly scary in that since the Iraq War, which they rightfully opposed because of and not all of them, obviously Hillary Clinton did not. Her speech as a senator in support of the war is another must viewing for anyone with any doubts whatsoever about the democratic process, the Democratic Party process in the United States. It is to marginalize, shame, and essentially kick out anyone that doesn't believe as they do. But since Barack Obama became president, the cultism has now included support of, among other things, censorship of any views that are not in their corner. And this is what scares me perhaps the most as a publisher. And I shan't mention the name of my publication because it'll seem like I'm trying to promote it, whereas I actually made this call just to have the honor of speaking with you. But the cult aspect of the censorship has gotten to the point, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, where YouTube, Twitter, and so on is now essentially a Democrat, that's big D Democrat operation. I was just looking at the New York Times headlines, and they say the lies of Donald Trump in the headline. Yeah, the New York Times has never been a very, other than partisan in many ways. But when it comes to this sort of thing, the Democratic Party, in their support of Hillary Clinton, has gone completely berserk when it comes to blaming it on Russia. And your comments were particularly pertinent. Your statements that the madness of Hillary Clinton extended to creating out of whole cloth this incredible narrative that she lost the election to Trump because of Russia. And this cult belief has been seized upon to the point where I can barely talk to my Democratic neighbors. I live in a very heavily Democratic state and in a very heavily Democratic neighborhood. Now, I happen to be visiting in Florida. And, George, I tell you, the culture shock to come to a state where Trump is being held up. I mean, I was in Key West the other day, and they're selling towels with Trump's image on them. Bath towels with Trump. the 1-2.
I would never take a bath with Donald Trump. That would be taking your life in your hands. I've got to tell you, Kyle, that was one top drawer telephone call. I'm really glad that you made it, and the best of luck with your publication. Let's go to New Jersey and talk with Joe on Joe Biden. Go ahead, Joe.
Hey, George. Good afternoon. Hey, God bless Julian.
Afternoon.
And power to the people. Hey, George, we just got robbed.
Amen.
Once again, the legislators of the Democratic Republican Party regime of habitual liars, fraudsters, and thieves just raped our America for another $40 billion. They tell the American people no money for Medicare, no money for the cold, hungry, homeless children from shore to shore across our America. No money for them. No money for the toothless, homeless veterans living in the woods and under bridges all across our America. No money for our schools. But yet, once again, they find plenty of money for those who own our legislators or those that they can profit from. Now they divert $40 billion away from we the people and our America. They divert this $40 billion to Nazis, to fascists, once again on the soil of Europe. We had over 430,000 Americans, soldiers, veterans, who sacrificed their lives fighting against on other lands exactly what our representatives represent today, the legislators. They represent fascists. They represent Nazis. They represent the one world order of authoritarian rule without regard for the elected choice of the world's people. Once again, we see this is in my opinion, the reincarnation of the Third Reich. I see NATO today as a new Nazi regime. Their goal, in my opinion, is to rule the world, to impose their one world order, their rules-based order upon the world's people, with zero regard for the will or want of the world's people. I see this, and I would like your view on this, but I see this, George, as basically the Fourth Reich. I don't see a greater threat.
No, I don't. I don't think we're there yet, Joe.
Okay.
But we're
Good.
definitely traveling in that direction, and there's a very real danger that is the destination that we will reach if we cannot find a way to stop it. It is the empire unleashed, of that there's no doubt. I have never had any doubt since being a student of the rise of fascism in the 20s and 30s in Europe, in Italy, in Germany, that the power will choose fascism if it needs to. If it can no longer rule in the old way of buying both fake adversaries in a fixed polity like yours and mine, if it can no longer guarantee its dominion, then it will choose fascism. It would prefer if that fascism was overseas rather than in their own country, and if it's to be in their own country, then they would prefer a fascism that did not announce itself as such, which came in sneakers and skinny black jeans and T-shirts, in Twitter headquarters, in Facebook headquarters, in newsrooms, in the boardrooms of the media companies, in the fancy journalistic salons like The Guardian and so on. They'd prefer it if it looked like that and did not announce itself with the sting of the jackboot, if it did not overtly march the people into the extermination camps. They would prefer to do it in a genteel way. But if they had to, they would unleash the iron heel. They would unleash the bayonet. They would unleash the death camp. Of that I have never been in any doubt. And undoubtedly the situation we now find ourselves in Europe, it may be that Turkey just saved the world by refusing to allow Sweden and Finland to enter NATO, at least for the present. It may be that Russian victories on the Ukrainian battlefield have been over the last week so sweeping that the military reality has begun to dawn, at least on certain European governments, about the direction of travel. But I don't believe that we are out of the woods. I do believe we are in trouble. And I'll be in trouble if I don't cross over now to my own good wife, Gayatri Galloway. It's a strange life when you can speak to your wife on screen. And there she is outside Edinburgh Castle. Thank you, Gayatri, for joining us. You've been looking at the voluminous social media traffic. What's rattling?
I have. It's good to be back. I haven't been on screen for a while, but here I am next to you, even though outside Edinburgh Castle. Just wanted to start off with the amount of audience and where they're watching from. Amsterdam, Jan Koen sends greeting from Amsterdam. Atiti Forbes sends a greeting from Berlin, the beautiful city of Berlin. Hungary, Brazil, Zambia, Ghana. Greetings from a Serbian in New York and France, and the list goes on. I'll start with R, who says, I'm a long-time lurker. I have always been seriously impressed by Mr. Galloway. I always used to love his style, passion, and intelligence, still so, more so. But I disagreed with much of what he said. I was a normie, but I've woken up since. Now I have so much more and deeper respect. Whilst I'm still not so sure about some of the esoteric arguments about how to create wealth for the population on every issue, from the pandemic, Ukraine, Palestine, the deep state, etc., I agree with this courageous gent. He's also very funny and protects freedom of speech and debate. Thank you, Mr. Galloway. Kant says, a brilliant history lesson from Gigi on the not so long ago evil past of NATO, which still today stands as a front to global US imperialism. And on the poll, which has just finished, but it's gathered quite some commentary, some on the situation in Australia itself. Desmond Knox says, for example, the election in Australia has fraud all over it. The independent candidates have a case, as the number on the ballot left blank, and voters often informed to ignore and vote only for the named ones. And Alan Russell says the establishment has decided it's time for the other cheek to have a go, keeping the status quo. Yeah, many are responding on the fact whether Labour will win in the UK general election in 2024. Flippin' CC says changing deck chairs on the Titanic, deep state Starmer or bonkers Boris. And Nicholas Franklin says the UK is not a democracy. The democratic process is for show, and historically Britannia was an aristocratic state run by the Privy Council and financed by the influential bankers right back to the Roman Empire. And Munzi says there is no Labour Party without Jeremy Corbyn. Right. William Hamilton says Labour will win because many true Tories will vote for the Reform Party and therefore split the vote. And Pasta says Starmer is a
I'm not seeing a great deal of support for the Reform Party, I must say. There is a by-election coming up in Wakefield. They are running in it. I'm going to support an independent councillor there from Wakefield. He was a Conservative councillor. He resigned the Conservative whip, now sits on the Wakefield Council as an independent. I'll be putting my support behind him. If he's watching now, he's welcome to call in. But you know, when it came to the Ukraine issue, the Reform Party went headlong, hook, line and sinker behind the Boris Johnson, Joe Biden axis. And for me, that was the end for them. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you. You've still got a couple of minutes. Give me some more.
Yeah, I'll give you some more. A very good one from Kias Al-Yafi. He says, why have a cheap version of the original? Today's Labour Party is a cheap version of the Conservatives. And Rob Jameson, he says, with a big enough majority to form the government, no. But I can say with some certainty that Labour will form an alliance to take power, because the Tories are finished. Marek, on the other hand, says, I think Labourers have had it, George. They've abandoned and looked down on the traditional voting base, being the working class, and only appeal to the metropolitan elites and the chattering classes of these days. And Ewan Hoch Union says, more to the point, will the working class benefit from the outcome of the 2024 election? As things stand, the answer is no. Fortunately, elections are but a small factor in the class struggle, and we are lucky to live in interesting times. Interesting times indeed.
We're doomed, as the Chinese say, to live in interesting times. And interesting indeed, as you say, they are. Look, the Australian Labour Party didn't so much win the Australian election as the so-called Liberals, in fact Conservatives, under Morrison lost it. Labour's first preference is, I think, about 52%, or their share of the vote is about 52%, but their first preference votes did not actually rise from the previous election. What's happened is the Conservative vote, small c, it's called the Liberal Party there, has collapsed. There's been a rise of independents. There's been people voting to the right of the Conservatives. None of that is applicable here in Britain. So the reason why I didn't like this poll, it conflates two entirely different polities, in my view. The Australian Labour Party, look, what happens in Australia has nothing to do with me. They can pursue whatever domestic policies they like. I'm interested in who runs Australia for only two reasons. First, are they going to try to get the release of their compatriot Julian Assange. Albanese, the new premier, said that he would, but that was a pre-election promise, and pre-election promises are oftentimes broken. I pray that he will live up to that promise that he made. And the second interest I have in who runs Australia is what their foreign policy will be. If they take Australia out of this arc towards war with, in their case, China, if they can step back from the belligerent, warlike, and mad policy of endless antagonism towards China, then I'll be satisfied with the Australian result. In Britain, the British Labour Party's foreign policy is worse than the Conservative Party's. Keir Starmer is worse than Boris Johnson. And so I'm not able to say that I'd be glad to see Labour in Britain winning. Thanks, Gayatri, for that. Let me take a break for what? I don't know, but you're about to find out.
There is no trick other than hard work, creativity, care, and recognizing that duty is more important than love.
The booming voice of Robert Maxwell, an arrogant man who used his publishing empire to gain him power and influence. But in this shocking account, never told before in this way, George Galloway recalls his first encounter with Maxwell.
It looked like a grizzly bear advancing towards me and punches me with these giant fists, like sides of ham, right in the solar plexus, so hard that I literally bent double.
Then, after George exposed Maxwell as a crook in Parliament, it was war.
Every one of his papers, the Daily Mirror, then following the Sunday Mirror, the Sunday People, the Daily Record, then a few days later the Sunday Mail in Scotland, even the European, which he then owned, all over Galloway.
Scottish Daily News journalist Ron Mackay was there.
Every night, presumably when he had a drink in him, he would boom over the tannoy about the cretins, the fools. The majority of the workforce believed that he would take it over and their jobs would be secure. But of course he didn't. He just disappeared.
And then...
The millionaire newspaper publisher Robert Maxwell is dead.
What really happened? Did Robert Maxwell jump, or was he pushed?
It could be that he went out to, as he did, micturate over the side of the boat. I'm with Ghislaine Maxwell in that I lean towards the murder.
This is Maxwell, the monster.
You said, what is my secret? I will let you and your viewers know what it is. I'm not attached to property. Consequently, losing or gaining it means nothing to me.
You know, and it's a very, thank you for, you know, I'm a big fan of your show, Gigi. Great debate, great. And I'm Scottish. I'm very passionate about what's happening there, you know. I had a great mom. She was Scottish, Mary MacLeod. She taught me well. She taught me well at everything, including golf. I love Scotland, and I love the Scottish food. It's great food. I said to Melania, you know, haggis. Look at that. What's more Scottish than that? Me. I am that haggis. She said, what, thin-skinned and full of crap?
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
I actually ate haggis 4 times last week. Moving back to Scotland has reintroduced me to the glories of our cuisine. Haggis is a wonderful thing, and it is nothing like Donald Trump. If you haven't tried it, please do. Now there's a quixotic poll to follow the one that I didn't like in the first half of the show. What did Napoleon do at the Battle of Waterloo? A, surrender. B, evacuate. Now this is a poll, you might say, only for the cognoscenti, only for those that know that the news media have been describing the surrender of the Ukrainian forces in the big sweep that's going on in the eastern part of the country as evacuation, as being withdrawn from their combat operation, when in fact the men involved are now all prisoners of war. Very large numbers of them now. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian forces now prisoners of war of Russia. The military part of the dreadful war in the Ukraine is definitely headed only one way. But some of the political aspects are getting very interesting indeed. Sensing that there's going to be two Ukraines at the end of this conflict, an eastern Ukraine and a western Ukraine, the NATO allies have begun moving into the western part, because obviously the western part will become, like Kosovo, a NATO protectorate. Polish forces are imminent in the next couple of days. Significant numbers of NATO member Poland's forces will move into Ukraine. My guess is that Russia will not oppose this, will not attack them, because they can see the value in Poland seeking to recapture some of the territory and cultural soft power that it had in Western Ukraine prior to 1945. Cities like Lvov, for example, are or were historically Polish cities. So the Americans have also begun arriving without announcement, without fanfare, but more and more American military, NATO personnel are undoubtedly in Western Ukraine. So we are headed towards the truncation of what we knew as the Ukrainian state. I myself am sad about that. I never wanted that to happen, and I firmly believe, will go to my grave believing, that it never needed to happen. If the Minsk II agreements had been implemented by the Ukrainian government, which promised to do so, and its promise was underwritten by both the German and the French governments, if that agreement had been implemented, none of what we have seen this year in this bloody war would ever have happened. Enough from me on that. So a quizzical little poll. What did Napoleon do at the Battle of Waterloo? A, surrender. B, evacuate. Now, I said earlier that Turkey may have saved the world by vetoing or announcing its intention to veto any entry into NATO by Finland or Sweden. It has its own set of reasons for doing that, none of which bear a great deal of examination, but if they do veto it, it will stop the creation of yet another casus belli between Russia and NATO. So I personally hope that Erdogan, the president of Turkey, will stick to his guns, if you will pardon the pun. In Sweden, there is a significant movement defending the neutrality of Sweden, which is, after all, several centuries old. Sweden has been, titularly at least, a neutral country for at least 200, it might be 300 years. We'll find out from our next guest. He's Frederik Wilcek, who is an anti-NATO activist in Sweden. I'm very glad to hear from you, Frederik. Thanks for joining us. Tell us,
Thank you for having me.
what's the attitude of the ordinary man and woman in the street in Sweden about tearing up your neutrality after centuries?
Well, the thing is that recent years, the opinion about NATO has been overall negative in Sweden. If you go back to just 2013, only 35% of the Swedes were positive to NATO. A different poll in 2014 says 31% of the Swedes were pro-NATO. And actually, the last election, the Social Democrats promised that we will never enter NATO when Sweden has a social democratic government. But we have a social democratic government now, and well, the polls changed when the war started, and in the last poll from the 10th of May, 53% of the Swedish population is pro-NATO. But I want to say that the propaganda in the what I call the bourgeois media has been very hard, and you have only heard pro-NATO stuff and anti-Russia stuff the last 6 months. So they have lobbied very hard for changing the Swedish citizens' view on NATO. The biggest argument here in Sweden is that NATO is a defensive organization, which we all know is a lie, as in your reportage from Serbia. Yeah.
Yeah, Serbia and Libya. I mean, what was defensive about a NATO attack on a North African country, namely Libya? How can people consider that to be a defensive? How can they consider that NATO's part in the occupation of Afghanistan is defensive? How can they believe that the destruction of Yugoslavia was a proper defensive organization? Swedish people are not stupid. They must be one of the best educated people in the world. So how come they're falling for this?
Oh, that's a hard question, because Sweden has, like you said, it's a 200-year history of being neutral in theory, at least, and during the most Swedes are voting for Social Democratic Party that have been ruling Sweden for almost 100 years, with some small breaks here and there, but they have dominated Swedish politics. And you for sure know the old Swedish Social Democratic leader Olof Palme, who was very, very active for this neutral thing. So there are this school of old Swedish Democrats, Swedish Social Democrats, that still oppose NATO, but they are like being silenced. They had a big party conference. They said when they were, the Social Democratic Party said that they will listen to their members, but instead it was like a Zoom meeting with a couple of thousand Social Democratic Party members that got a lecture from the pro-NATO leadership of the Social Democratic Party. But I think that if you look in the society and outside in our regular lives, we meet a lot of people that are still for Swedish neutrality. Because I saw a joke about, they said that we take less time to decide if we want to join NATO or not than we take which bag of chips we want to buy in the store for a Friday night. But I think that the lobbying has been extreme and for NATO, and the propaganda has been massive. At the same time, like yesterday was a national anti-NATO day in Sweden. I counted 17 big cities, the 17 biggest cities in Sweden, there were demonstrations against NATO. And you don't see the media reporting about that. And I know that today the protests continue in Gothenburg and Stockholm. And the media ignores that, so they don't want to show that there are a big opposition against NATO in Sweden, because the ones I'm a communist, so I think that the one who rules Sweden is the capitalists, and it's the richest capitalist in Sweden called Wallenberg was the first one to have a meeting with NATO when the decision from the Social Democrats came. So I think that it's a big machine working for NATO membership, but the Swedish population is split up. But I think it's still a strong grassroots movement against NATO. Only if you look back in 2017, when they had this big military drill called Aurora 17, there was thousands of people demonstrating in the streets. So you should not underestimate. I can't talk English.
No, I don't. No, I don't. And look, 50-50 is a very slim margin to make a decision of such magnitude on so quickly, as you say, quicker than the decision as to what crisps to buy for your Friday night TV viewing. Shouldn't there at least be a referendum on this?
Yeah, I think that the situation that is now is a whole, like you say. Only if you look back, like I told before, look back to 2017, only 32% of the Swedish population was pro-NATO. So this is a window where the imperialists see an opportunity to push Sweden into NATO. But if you wait 6 months, the situation can be a whole different, and the pro-NATO stance will shrink maybe. So that's why they are hurrying up, because this is maybe the only time in this decade when they can push Sweden into NATO. And there is a joke going around here that is, Sweden has to join NATO. Why? Because we're threatened. Why are we threatened? Yeah, because we want to join NATO. That is, it's some kind of moment 22. And so people still see that that neutrality is the way to peace, and we want peace. Swedish people want peace. We haven't had war in our territory for 200 years, and we want that to stay.
Well, we better hope the Turks dig their heels in and do as they've promised to do and veto it. I certainly hope so. Thanks, Frederik, for providing that window from Sweden, which we don't often get here on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. To my eternal surprise, what did Napoleon do at the Battle of Waterloo? 56% say surrender, 44% say evacuate. And that's roughly true of all the other platforms. Let's go to the phone lines, to Wisconsin this time, and talk with James on the Ukraine. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, hello, George. I just had a question that came up to me regarding the funding that the U.S. is sending to Ukraine. And it's an idea that came to me from listening to your show and your discussion about how Britain had just recently managed to pay off its war debt from World War II. And that got me started thinking.
2007.
That perhaps part of the motivation for the U.S. sending as much economic aid as it's been sending to Ukraine is precisely for that purpose, to make Ukraine indebted to the U.S. and thus for economic forces here to have greater control over what's happening in the country, and of course to turn a higher profit, because they'll be paying, instead of $100 billion back to us, they'll be paying $300 billion or more. Do you, as someone with experience in international politics, do you think that that's part of the motivating factor for what the U.S. is now doing in regards to Ukraine?
I really don't, James. First of all, the interest earned will not be that great. It will not be 100 billion to 300 billion. Secondly, the amount of time over which it will be paid is gargantuan. As I say, what we were given by the US in 1941, we didn't pay off until 2007. I was on air with the mother of all talk shows the very day that we finally cleared our debt to the US. So I don't think that's a significant part of the motivation. Secondly, Ukraine is not going to be in a position to repay anything to anybody or to be able to turn a profit for anybody. All of the oil and gas will be in the east of the country, which will no longer be a part of Western Ukraine. And most of the agricultural wealth, which is considerable, will be in the eastern part of the country. I compare what will be the West Ukrainian state to Kosovo. Kosovo is a 100% dependency on the United States and NATO. It earns nothing, at least nothing over the counter. Earns a lot under the counter, as I said in my piece. But for NATO and the Western governments that comprise it, Kosovo would literally be a sink. It exists only as a protectorate of NATO and for geopolitical reasons. And that's what I think Western Ukraine will be. It will be writ large and therefore much more expensive a dependency. It will be the next Kosovo. Thanks, James. Jan is in New York. Let's go to Jan. Go ahead, Jan. What would you like to say?
Yeah, hi. How are you, George? I've
good.
Been
nice
a tremendous
to hear from
fan
you.
of yours. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Very well. Good.
Yeah.
No, I've been a tremendous fan of yours ever since you you spoke in front of the U.S. Congress so many years ago.
That was a good day. 17 years ago.
Well, that's a long time, George. Anyway, by the way, you talk about, you talked about one of your last callers talked about reparations. Very interesting. But what nobody ever brings up is the fact that, from 1825, Haiti was paying reparations to both France and then also Citibank, all right, because they were also involved in that until
for overthrowing slavery. Yeah, that's right. Actually.
Right. I mean, it's just it's so unconscionable. The reason why I'm calling is that I tell you, I have a real problem with politics and what have you, for a simple reason that I've really come to the conclusion that the structure of the nation state throughout history, and I throw out this question constantly to people, and nobody can answer it. I ask them the following: tell me which nation state throughout human history has been able to exist without resorting to intimidation, violence, corruption, all the other things, and then at the end, I add murder. And you know what? I have never received an answer from anybody, George. And so consequently,
well, I'll give you an answer. The answer is none, Jan. But the corollary is also true. the corollary is also true. No other form of organization other than the nation state has managed to survive without all those things that you just mentioned. So, for example, the European Union became a byword for a lack of democracy, anti-democracy. So abolishing the nation state and pooling its sovereignty with other states is not a guarantee of peace and amity.
Right. Yeah. So, but I mean, it's, I look at all the things that are going on, and there's nothing but lying and I mean, cheating, lying, and why do we even bother? And so I have decided for myself personally to approach this from the same standpoint as Leo Tolstoy in his book, The Kingdom of God is Within Us, which was a tremendously influential book with Mahatma Gandhi, and I feel that for me personally is my root. And I will very openly say on this forum that I don't sing any national anthems. I don't pledge any allegiances except to the Almighty. That's the only allegiance that I pledge. And I don't do any of that kind of stuff. I'm not interested in it. And I mean, they can burn me at the stake, or they can do whatever they want to do. But I mean, I just have had it with this hypocrisy. I mean, anywhere you look, it's hypocrisy. And it's just upset me tremendously. But I just wanted to, wanted to contact you because I tell you, there are so many things that you come out with that nobody else will ever talk about. And I commend you for it, and I thank you for it.
God bless you, Jan. And they'll never burn you at the stake because we'll never divulge your whole identity if they come for you. Last call before the break. Wayne is in Cheshire. Go ahead, Wayne.
Always a pleasure, George.
Go ahead, sir.
I wanted to speak about the Black Sun Wheel, which has been spoke about this evening. I wanted to tell the viewers and the public what it actually stands for, because powers that be have attempted to write it out of history. Being very basic, it started in a bar in 1929 in Bavaria, and there was two names we're going to use. There was the Vril or the Fool. They call themselves the Fool Society, and they use that emblem. Hitler, Himmler, Dr. Hans Kammler were parts of it, and they were the hierarchy cult of basically the Third Reich. So the third wheel actually stands for, it means negative power. It stands for black matter and dark arts, basically black magic using human sacrifices to obtain some sort of intelligence, wisdom and power. And when parts of the Fool Society and the hierarchy of the Nazis, they were doing secret experiments and they were using the emblem and using human sacrifices to obtain information, power and all the rest of it. So when these people wear this insane black wheel sun, I just wanted everyone to know what it actually stands for.
Well, it sounds eminently to be avoided. It's no coincidence. I don't believe it's a coincidence for one moment that the mass murderer in Buffalo was brandishing the very same emblem of the black sun as the Azov Nazi regiment, not battalion, regiment in the Ukrainian army. Dark forces indeed, dark matter indeed. Thanks for that, Wayne. I appreciate it. Remember to donate if you want to join the Fighting Fund to relaunch the Wednesday show, MOATS Extra. You can do that on the Super Chat function on YouTube, or you can donate through the website. I'm going to take a quick break, and then I've got something to tell you about killing Kelly.
You have to remember back in 2002, 2003, there was a wish by George Bush for regime change. That's what was driving him. Nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, which of course didn't exist in Iraq. So they had to construct some sort of formula, some sort of cover story, in order to persuade the British public that intervention in Iraq was right. Now, David Kelly, as an expert in weapons of mass destruction, knew that this was untrue. He knew that there were probably no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
That was a guy that could have brought down the whole system.
I reckon you're chaff. You're being thrown up to divert our probing.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that parliamentarian briefing, I think that was an indignity to him.
We saw it on the news, and my very first thought was shock. Oh my God, you know, this man is in the eye of the media hurricane. He should be protected by that at least.
You've got blood on your hands, Prime Minister. Are you going to resign over this?
I don't know the details of how Lord Hutton happened to be selected, but what was certainly the case is that he was the right kind of judge to use from the point of view of Downing Street and the intelligence services as well.
Of the 21 days of hearing, only one half of one day was spent on discussing the forensic aspects. That is disgusting.
We were given the Hutton report the day before it was published, but actually what happened was he went too far.
The events of 2003 were disgraceful ones in this country's history, and it's unfinished business. Those responsible for an illegal war, those responsible for the death of David Kelly, have not been brought to justice. There's been no inquest into David Kelly's death. There needs to be one. We need to make sure that those who behaved in a reprehensible way in 2003 are finally brought to book.
Global higher education with one of the world's best-known iconoclasts. The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Now, I'm going to be presenting the Killing Kelly film in Newcastle. I don't know if you've just seen the graphic of that, but if not, perhaps you can see it now. It's at the Copthorne Hotel. There it is there. Monday, the 27th of June. Tickets are going well, actually. So if you are anywhere in the northeast of England, or for that matter, in the southeast of Scotland, you're in good travelling distance to Newcastle, come along and see me. I'll be presenting the film and I'll be taking questions and answers after the presentation at the Copthorne Hotel in Newcastle on Monday, the 27th of June. Hope to see you there. Amongst many other things, I'll be signing my new book. Finally arrived, the sequel to the Queensway novel that you have already seen, hopefully have already read. I do a lot of things in my life, but I'm inordinately proud of this. I never thought I'd become a novelist that people would want to read, and I'm very happy. So I'll be signing that at the meeting in Newcastle, but you could also get it in the shop, of course, the georgegalloway.shop, and if you do it that way, I'll be able to sign and dedicate it. So please, if you bought the first book, you'll definitely want to buy the second, and if you want to buy them both, well, I'll be very happy indeed. Professor Steve Keen, the rock and roll economist, quite to his surprise, ended up an Australian senator at the last election. He's no longer in the Senate, I think, but he keeps a very sharp eye on Australian politics, as well as his economics work, which I support on Patreon, as indeed he supports my work. Professor I can call you now, Senator, former Senator Steve Keen. Thanks for joining us at this unearthly hour down under. I'm glad that you did, though. I don't know about you, but I feel like celebrating the defeat of the Prime Minister, Morrison, and his crew. How about you?
I mean, it was a bit disappointing for my party to do as badly as it did, because it did, frankly, quite badly in the polling. But to see Morrison go was an absolute delight. And if I hadn't had the effect of, seeing poor results for the party I was in, I would have been out there dancing in the streets, even though my knee is virtually falling off with old age these days. So it's a fantastic outcome. And he's the lowest Prime Minister we've ever had. And it's fantastic to see the end of him.
Now, he is the lowest Prime Minister you've ever had, and you've had a few low-down skunks as Prime Minister. What was particularly low about him?
Complete lack of integrity. It really came down to personal characteristics in addition to his own politics. But if I had to summarise in one line, he's turned neoliberalism into a religion. So he's got, in my point of view, and having had a relationship with a narcissist, he's a classic case of narcissistic personality disorder, as was Trump, so that's a good start. And a lot of people then use religion as a cover, which Trump, of course, also did. I believe he does too. And his religion is this, what they call the prosperity gospel. And the best example of how obscene this was is that he had made a complete stuff up of getting rapid antigen tests for the country. And then, whereas in America they were given away free, land of the free is normally land of the expensive for medical, given away free in America, had to buy them in Australia if he could find them. And so a journalist challenged him at a press conference and said, some people can't afford to buy rapid antigen tests. His answer was, and I quote, some people can, some can't. Now, the only way you can dissect that is, he said, if you're rich and you love God, then you can buy antigen tests. And if you're poor and you don't love God, then you can't. And it's your own bloody fault. And that was the nature of the government he gave us.
Yes, not necessarily to be replaced by a better one, though. From what I know of the Australian Labor Party, you'll know much more than me. It's a bit two cheeks of the same arse, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, not that badly, but it's close. I mean, what you have is fundamentally we're a coal and a raw resources exporting country, with fundamentally coal being the major export, and the Liberals are beholden to the coal barons, and the Labor Party is beholden to the coal unions. And they basically, you get the worst politicians money can buy in the country on both sides. Better principles on the Labor side with the union touch itself, of course, but they don't want to give away the revenue from coal or the votes from coal miners or their communities. So both parties have promised to continue opening new coal mines. Now that's the opposite of what we should be doing, and my party was, of course, saying we should shut them all down.
And what about poor Julian? Can he look forward to Albo doing the same in power as he said he would do when he was in opposition? Will the British be hearing from the new Australian Prime Minister?
I hope so. I think he will. I mean, Albo Albanese is a graduate of the political economy department at Sydney University that I helped establish. So he has a strong working class background, raised by a single mother and so on. So there's a deep degree of personal integrity to him, the opposite of what you saw with Morrison. And I think if he said that he's going to let Julian come free, then he'll try to do it. But I'm going to brace myself because, the extent to which Australia's been the lapdog of America through the last 20th century still continues today, and he may well get pressure to say, you can't do that. Now, that would disgust me, but it's feasible that could happen.
Quite. Now, what happens in Australia is a matter, of course, for the Australian people. It's not my job to pick policies for them, but I am entitled to a view on Australia's foreign policy, which has been simply disastrous. They had a good relationship with their neighbour, China, and they chose to pick a fight with China to please somebody just about as far away from Australia as it's possible to be, namely the United States. Is that going to change? Will Australia at least now turn down the dial on belligerence against China?
It'll turn it down, but the dial's still going to be there to some extent. I mean, it's crazy when you're attacking China, you're attacking our major trading partner, and it's and there's a large Chinese community here as well. And of course, you're going to have your negative attitudes about the Chinese Communist Party and effectively the classic 19th century imperialism we're seeing rising in both Russia and China. There's unfortunately, global power politics is back in fashion at a disastrous time for humanity. But you have to have a sane relationship with China, and I think that's feasible. It'll happen with the Labor Party. We have people like Penny Wong, who's Chinese heritage. Quite a few people in the Labor Party have that background. So the ludicrous white Anglo-Saxon garbage that the Liberal Party threw out that defined their political posturing, I think that's over. Whether the Labor will break away from the influence of the Americans, again, I'll hold my breath. I won't be happy if they fail to do it, but I have to brace myself that that's a possible outcome.
And what about the pledge to finally afford justice to the original Australians, the Aboriginal Australians? Is that just displacement activity, or is that real?
It's real. I mean, I think we should have Aboriginal representation in the Parliament by right, which is, of course, is the case in New Zealand, which is the progressive country in the Antipodes. So I think that I'm not sure that they'll go that far, but I think they should. Now, they certainly will improve the rhetoric on Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal people in this country. It will transfer to some extent, but I mean, you're thinking about the two cheeks of the same bum. I described the Liberal Party as being neoliberal and proud, and they'll do stuff and brag about what they do. And the Labor Party is neoliberal and embarrassed, and they'll apologise for what they do. They'll do much the same thing. This is one of the areas where they can break away from that category, but there's still, to go the full hog of saying we should have Aboriginal, First Nation people effectively having a stay in the politics by right. I don't think they'll go that far.
Now, you can measure our joy at Morrison's defeat in the almost hysterical response of Rupert Murdoch's media empire in Australia. It's a big defeat for Morrison. It's a big defeat for Rupert Murdoch too, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, as Kevin Rudd, and I've had no great time for Kevin Rudd as a leader of the Labor Party, by the way, but Kevin Rudd has started an anti-Murdoch movement, one that's looking like it's gaining momentum. And he pointed out in the last 23 elections, every last Murdoch paper has supported the Conservatives, the Liberals, as they call over here, which is a joke, of course. And they just threw everything they could at trying to get Morrison elected, and they've failed. So it's getting to the stage where the annoying squawk on the right of your ear, and you just basically ignore them, and that's good for the country. What I hope to see now is a royal commission into the influence Murdoch has had over the last 40 or 50 years in Australia.
And lastly, and I'll let you get back to bed, Steve, what for Her Majesty now? Is Australia now set on a Republican course?
I don't think so, George, I'm afraid to say. It's not a major issue over here. So if you do push for a republic, then that can be used as a divisive weapon by the Liberal Party, and they run you down. So it's probable we'll just put up with Charles and on we'll roll. The real sense of a national identity doesn't seem to be big enough to make us make that move. And the same thing applies in New Zealand. It's a much more progressive country. It's just not taken all that seriously, unfortunately.
Very interesting. Very interesting. That'll be good news in the palace if they're watching, as I'm sure they are. Professor Steve Keen, you'll always be Professor Steve. No one can take that away from you. the rock and roll
Indeed.
economist. Thanks for joining us at this unearthly hour. Now, the poll has been surprisingly interesting to people, even though, as a matter of fact, I'm not sure most people even understand it, but 2,200 of you have voted, and half, roughly, a bit more than half, think that Napoleon, in fact, surrendered at Waterloo. Remember, you can donate any time at all, not just during the show, on the Super Chat function on YouTube or at moats.tv and go to the donate button. Calls to bring us to the end of the show. Richard in Manchester. Richard, welcome back.
Good afternoon. I mean, good evening, George. I thought I was in Australia then for a minute. How are you, George?
Chance would be a fine thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely wonderful place. I'm going to give a big plug, George, because I think you deserve it. One, for saving the MOATS, which is a fascinating program. It's beyond my intelligence sometimes, and it makes me think, which is a great thing. It means that probably I won't get dementia too quick. So you might put that in as an advert.
Exactly.
for watching the MOATS show.
We'll clip that. We'll clip that, and we'll use that, Rich. Thanks.
That's brilliant. But the killing of Kelly is a fascinating subject, and everybody in Newcastle, my wife comes from up there, and I know a lot of Geordies, and they should all go and see that show. You should be in a big arena somewhere and really answering big questions, because when I went with my family last year, I was fascinated with your attitude and the attitude of the people around you, and the open attitude to what is going on in politics in this country, and has been, I think, honestly, since Clinton and Blair got together and went and sorted everything out as they thought they were doing in Yugoslavia and split Yugoslavia. And I'm afraid, George, I feel fear for this country in what is happening now, where they want to split up the Union, Scotland and England, and now Ireland is getting involved because it's opportunistic at this moment in time, and I don't blame them for that. But I think, really, people should be alerted to the fact that Blair is trying to smash the democracy throughout the world, because he wants this open borders, he wants a world domination, things that you actually touched on tonight, as far as I could understand. And we don't want that, George, and I'm sure that people should come out in some form and say, look, we don't want it. Can you please go away? And I don't know how to attack it in my own naive way.
Well, it's a powerful point that you make, and in a way it's the overarching point. I wrote yesterday that globalization is not some dewy-eyed internationalist project of doing away with borders and the rest. It's about the homogenization of humanity, the better to be placed under the heel of monopoly capitalism. No small capitalism, no medium-sized capitalism, just the big oligarchs, absolutely controlling the whole economy of the whole world, and the enforcer of that system being the American empire. That's why every one of us, whether we are left, right, or center, should oppose it. Whether we love the nation state because we love it, or because we, in my case, consider the nation state to be the only method in this historical epoch in which democracy can be implemented, defended, and implemented. It's the only unit big enough but small enough to be democratically controlled, and therefore a countervailing force to the big monopoly power of the oligarchs. Whether you love flags and anthems and queens and all the rest, or whether you're like me, a believer that the British state is of a sufficient size to make it worthwhile, and also that it can be governed democratically. A state that is vast is not easy to govern democratically. A state which is too small is hardly worth the trouble of governing it democratically, because it will be swatted away as a fly. But monopoly power enforced by the US empire is something that 99% of the people of the world can be won to opposing. And that's the game I'm in, Rich. Thanks a lot. Caroline is in Coatbridge. Go ahead, Caroline.
Yes, good evening, George. It's not, I don't need a reply from you. Everything that you've done in your life, my big brother that you said on Easter Sunday, God bless to, hadn't seen him since prior to Easter Sunday. Saw him yesterday, and the first thing he says to me, condemning Putin, I reminded him about his explanation in the 1947 Rogue State and how he explained to me about George Galloway being in the Big Brother house, and I couldn't take you serious after that. When he explained, do you know that man's in there for the Gaza Strip? So he explained everything to me. He stood with you with apartheid. He stood with you in Bloody Sunday. And he stood with you with the Ballymurphy massacre. That was a massacre in Ireland in 1972 for the benefit of the people that don't know that, with the same para-regiment. No, he stood with you in Iraq as well. He doesn't believe there's an official Nazi army in Ukraine. He doesn't believe about the 2014. He doesn't know anything about it. It's not that he doesn't believe the 2014, but I don't know exactly your words, so I wanted you to do your own words, and I also want you to explain
Well, I will.
About the $500 million that Zelensky's worth. I won't say any more. You address it to my brother, his name's Peter, and it's from his wee sister Caroline. Thank you.
Peter, Caroline understands this, and I hope by the time I finish speaking, so will you. Zelensky has $500 million in the bank, offshore in the tax havens in the Caribbean. We know that because it was leaked in the Pandora Papers. So you don't need me to tell you it. You can go and read it yourself. You don't have to take any of that on trust. It's exposed in the Pandora Papers. But that's the least of the problems. I'm not even going to ask you to believe me. I'm going to ask you to believe Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone, the man that campaigned for all those years so that we could know what really happened to our co-religionist Jack Kennedy, the President of the United States, cruelly murdered in Dallas in 1963. Oliver Stone is the man that did more than anybody else to try and expose the truth about what happened to Jack Kennedy. You know him. You can trust him. So watch his film on the Ukraine, which you can watch for nothing, zero, on YouTube right now. Ukraine on Fire by Oliver Stone. Watch it and then apologize to Caroline because she was right all along. It's Melvin in New York. Go ahead, Melvin.
Hello, George. Do you hear me?
I hear you loud and clear. Always good to hear from you. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, it's nice to talk to you again. Okay, so I came across something on the news today. Apparently, the United States has posted an act saying that if there are WMDs used in Ukraine, okay, that there will be troops being put on ground, which, to my understanding, will bring us into World War III. So I'd like to get your opinion on this because it's a really messed up situation. Do you think they would do a false flag like they have in other places?
Russia, why would Russia need to use weapons of mass destruction in a war that they are comprehensively winning? So if that really is the position of the United States, it can only be because they have knowledge of, or perhaps intention to, themselves in a false flag operation to use weapons of mass destruction. In which case we will be in World War III. So the people, including the power in the United States, has to have their eyes wide open before going into that inferno, because they will not escape, and their families will not escape, their friends will not escape, their property, the riches will not escape World War III. Nobody will escape it. Of course, there will be a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, deep underground in nuclear bomb-proof bunkers, but when they emerge from those bunkers, it will be to a world that has been completely incinerated and poisoned by radioactivity, which will soon deal with anyone who has been underground during the nuclear exchange. So everyone needs to know that that's what the end game or the end result of this game would be. And who would want that? Who, even Satan, would have to think twice about willfully going into that good night, because even Satan would be short of things to do and people to do it with if the world came to an end in that way. So I beg you, Melvin, to tell your compatriots that if this is the policy of the United States, it can only be, as it was in other places, like Syria, an alibi for a false flag attack which they have knowledge of or intention to themselves launch. I pray that it's not true. I hope that it's not true. But I have a very real fear that it is true. Thanks, Melvin.
Me too.
In New York. Last call from the legend, Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma. No, Norma, just go to Norma, please. And while you're getting her, let me say, I don't have any social, but I have things to say. I have things to say. We've had technical difficulties tonight. I don't know if you saw them. They've all been in my ear, perhaps. But we've dealt with some of the most important issues in the world tonight on this show. And this show only continues to exist because of you, who donated in that period of 5 weeks or so, where we had no other means of sustenance. I myself have not been paid for nearly 2 months. And I don't know when I'll be paid again. But I'm not as concerned about that as I was about the show disappearing. Now we've saved the Sunday night mother of all talk shows. Please spread the word, because we need 1 million people on the button every Sunday at 7 p.m. and in the course of the week watching and discussing this show. We've saved it. Let's build it now and make it bigger still. And if you keep donating, we might get back to a Wednesday night show also. The last caller is the legend, Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George. Just to tell you, there is a demonstration protesting against Tony Blair's knighthood on Monday, the 13th of June. It's organised by Stop the War, and it's 1 o'clock at the Queen Vic statue, Castle Hill, Windsor. Only last week, we didn't know there was going to be one, but there is.
Give me the dates again, because I know nothing about this. I'm just one of the founders of the Stop the War movement.
Yeah, I know.
I was one of the main promoters of the petition, which got 1 million signatures, but I know nothing of any demonstration in Windsor. But I'm glad it's happening.
Yeah.
Give us the date again, Norma.
Monday the 13th of June, that's
At
when
what time?
he's going to... 1 o'clock at the Queen Vic statue, Castle Hill, Windsor, organised by Stop the War. And...
Okay.
Hello?
I'm glad to hear it. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
One quick last point. You know this new Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese, apart from supporting Julian Assange, he actually supports the United Nations Treaty on the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Now, that's a new era for them, and the fact that he's got good and bad points, I think that is a very interesting point, especially when he's a friend of America.
And I'm very glad that you made that. Because no, I didn't. And it's important because this new AUKUS, Australia, UK, and the United States, is, of course, a nuclear-armed alliance.
I know.
Australia doesn't have nuclear weapons, but it's going to now have nuclear-powered submarines, which is a very short step away from having nuclear weapons. So if that's the case, Norma, I'm very glad to hear it. And I wish the new Prime Minister of Australia every success. Last word to you, Norma.
Well, I just wondered if we'll take any notice if that comes to... I've read it twice on Twitter, and it's a big picture of him, and he actually says he does support the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So that's another thing to celebrate about the guy.
Of course, he wouldn't be he wouldn't be the first to have believed that and then abandon it, and especially if the United States locks him into this position of hostility towards China. But we must hope for the best. What else can we do, Norma?
Well, I thought it was quite interesting, really. And I thought it was something to celebrate. I know there's the China, the America thing, but he actually has stated that and support for Julian Assange release.
That's the one that I think can be achieved. If he will now say to the British government, as an alternative to extraditing Julian to the United States, we formally ask you, the United Kingdom, our mother country, to in fact return our son Julian Assange to us, where we will ensure that he is returned to the bosom of his family, reunited with his wife and children, and will live a lawful life, practicing his trade as a publisher and as a journalist for the remainder of his life, then I think that would be the greatest ever achievement of any Australian Premier ever. So, Mr. Anthony Albanese, in wishing you every success in your Prime Ministry, I beg you, please stand up for Julian Assange. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you, and if it was, come back next week at the same time, same place on the mother of all talk shows. I wish you a good night.